Hello and welcome to the Northern Nine podcast. This week's episode is a chat with the journalist and writer Una Mullally, a regular on the podcast. We've had her many times before. I thought Una would be a good person to talk about all the issues and things that are happening around music in the context of Palestine and Israel at the moment. There are so many things that are happening in terms of reactions and consequences for people. Artists speaking out, artists cancelling festivals because of the owners having a link to Israeli goods and services, to the Kneecap situation, of course, where Liam O'Hanna, aka Mo Chara, is up with a terrorism charge in London for displaying a Hezbollah flag at a gig in London. This all came about, obviously, after the band played Coachella and showed a anti-Israeli message highlighting the genocide that's happening in Palestine. There's a lot happening at the moment in music festivals. So let's go over some of them before we chat to Una. I want to talk about some of the stuff that's been happening with Kneecap, like I mentioned, which a lot of people, I'm sure, who are listening to this will be aware of. The band have suggested there's been a concerted effort for them to be cancelled, especially coming out of the US. Their US booking agent has dropped them, and as a result, their US visas are now in a state of limbo. And that is one thing, and they have been consistently talking about their support for Palestine. Last weekend we saw at the Wide Awake Festival in London, huge amount of support for Kneecap. So that is in the context of everything that's happened in the last year and a half. I'm talking about Irish artists cancelling at South by Southwest, The Great Escape and Latitude being put under pressure to remove Barclays from their sponsorship because Barclays have invested in Israel before and are on the BDS list. Now, BDS is a big part of this. BDS is hugely important. If you don't know what BDS is, you should now. It's Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions, BDS, a Palestinian-led movement for freedom, justice and equality. And that is a targeted boycott campaign. Obviously, Ireland knows lots about boycotts. And so we're seeing a lot of this. We've seen a lot of this in the last year or so. We've seen a lot of this with as I mentioned, the Irish artists cancelling South by Southwest due to the US military involvement and the US military's involvement in Israel and what they're doing to the Palestinian people. We're also seeing the likes of Superstruct, who are a festival global conglomerate who own 80 festivals around Europe, who have been facing multiple cancellations from artists. And I'm talking, these festivals include the likes of Sziget, Sonar, Field Day, Mighty Hoopla, Why Not? And in January 2025, it acquired Boiler Room. So that's Superstruct. They are owned by a private equity firm called KKR. And KKR also invest in Israeli companies that develop data centers and advertise real estate on illegally occupied land, as well as they have documented ties to weapons manufacturers as well, who operate in Israel. So this is a red line. This is the point where people are starting to make a stand about what is happening in music, the kind of people and companies that are funding festivals. It's a bit of an awakening. It's a bit of a revolutionary time in lots of ways. You may have been following. There's so many things been going on with the festivals, even in the last couple of months. The Superstruct festivals have been putting out these statements where they're saying stuff like, we can't divest from our owners. And even Superstruct themselves put out a statement saying all the revenue stays in our business. But the point is, if you're owned by somebody, a company that is investing in genocide and contributing to that, then you are complicit in it as well. So it makes it very difficult to navigate that. It also makes it very difficult for artists to navigate this whole new world that was never really as obvious in the last 20 years as it is now. There's many different reasons for this. I think Palestine has become such a huge flashpoint in morality in global life now. And it's for artists navigating that. There are a lot of people who don't say anything because they're looking after their self-interest. And in a way that's understandable, but in a way it's morally wrong. So it's kind of, our chat with Una is really a chance to operate and talk a bit about that rather than relay everything that's been happening in the last year. We talk a lot about these issues in terms of what's happening, what could be happening, how effective are boycotts, how effective are strikes, what's happening with Kneecap, what is going to happen with Kneecap. There's a lot to discuss. So the awakening and the realization that people have about the private equity firms and all of these capitalist entities that are currently operating in music. We've touched on it before with Spotify and how people are much more aware now that, say, Daniel Ek has been investing in some really dodgy things over the years. And then as a consumer and as a person going to festivals, a person streaming music, you have an opportunity to then decide what you should do. And that's the empowerment part of it. So we'll be talking about that. We'll be talking about music festivals, empowerment, Kneecap, what comes next, and what we can do for, long term and short term to, first of all, help the people of Palestine who are severely under occupation, who are being killed daily. It's absolutely horrific what's happening there. Let's talk to Una about all that. So, Una, so much has been happening in the last couple of years, last year and a half, in terms of protest and boycotts and call-outs in music lately. Solidarity with Palestine has been a big catalyst of what's going on in music recently. We've seen Irish artists cancel at South by Southwest, protesting at the US military involvement, and Barclays pulling out of Great Escape and other festivals like Latitude, the Isle of Wight, boycotts of German cultural institutions, pressure on Kneecap to be taken off festival bills for what they said and being saying anti-Israeli stuff. Boiler Room and other festivals owned by a big global events company called Superstruct, who are basically financed by a private equity firm who invest in Israel. So a lot of artists have been calling and looking for the festivals and artists playing those festivals to cancel those and to kind of... It basically gets, I think there's been an awakening really of what's happening in music and with artists and people attending festivals and stuff. So that's just some of the things that have happened recently, and they're being allowed to show a Palestinian flag at two of their events. So they didn't play those gigs and they played acoustic sets outdoors instead. And festivals like Field Day, where I think the number that I saw of the artists that cancelled those festivals in protest of the ownership of the festivals was I think there was 20 or so acts cancelled from that festival just this weekend gone. So, what are your feelings on, are we in a kind of unprecedented time for the visibility of protest and boycott in music? Have we ever had it like this before? I'm sure, people always talk about, South Africa and apartheid and some of the stuff that happened around that time as a part of this. But in terms of music and protest, have we ever seen this before?
I think this is a really generational event in so many different ways. Obviously there's what's happening with regards to Israel's war on Gaza, for one. It's not a new thing, but obviously what we're seeing now in terms of what's being characterized as genocide is so heightened, so appalling. And I think the general global inaction, be that across the European Union, individual governments, the US, these kind of, how all of the political action or inaction is doing nothing effective to stop all the killing. That feels new in its potency and in its horror. I think the activism part of it is not unique, but I think it's just growing. I think apartheid South Africa is a very good example. I think you can look at loads of different waves of different kinds of protest and resistance and activism. Sometimes that's to, the freedom to gather itself. You go back to, the criminal justice bill in the UK and the shutting down of rave culture. Or if you look at, queer activism, if you look at, solidarity with minors in the UK back in the day, if you look at, these kind of different waves of, rock against racism or rock the vote or rock against homelessness, or all these different kind of waves happen. But I think what is interesting about this is how widespread it is, and how it is also unpicking a lot of other issues that we have in society that are kind of around capitalism and what ethical culture looks like, and what participation in culture looks like when controlling forces are doing terrible things, funding terrible things, complicit in terrible things, and what that means. And yeah, I definitely think the impulse to boycott or pull out or highlight private equity ownership structures, or, sponsors that people perceive as bad actors or complicit, feels much more potent. And I think that's a consequence of a generational shift. It's also a consequence of what's happening and how widespread the movement is becoming. And I do think that a lot of people are becoming very politicized around Palestine right now, and also really losing trust, in government structures, and then in all of the other kind of economic and geopolitical and institutional structures that we're kind of seeing. That's happening on all ends of the political spectrum. So we're in this, I suppose we are in an unprecedented in some ways times, definitely in this century anyway.
Yeah. I mean, even today we're seeing, the occupied territories bill being, watered down or like being changed to the point where it's like basically completely ineffective. So, I think we are much more, because the information is there now and we're much more readily aware of it, and we can understand these differences and the nuances of bills that stop us trading with Israel and buying goods and services from them, that the ordinary person now can understand what that difference between those things are. Where, I think that's one positive of maybe the huge amount of information we now have available to us. We can learn about these things much quicker. And obviously, like you said, there's so much more. There is so many different activist groups and so many different people who are highlighting these things and talking about them, even on Instagram, where it's like, people talk about being shadow banned all the time, but it's like people are still using it for these kind of conversations as well.
Well, it's about where you get your information as well, right? I mean, because you can, never before has there been such an abundance of information and reporting, and, reporting as in, people kind of seeing videos coming out of Gaza and all that kind of stuff. And at the same time, if you're not on a particular platform, you're not seeing any of that. So I think that this is where it intersects with a younger generation and with popular culture more generally. People under the age of 40 are not reading print newspapers or sitting down to watch the nightly news or whatever. And so it makes sense that the wave of activism around this, although it is obviously intergenerational, plenty of people have been active on Palestine, for decades and decades. There is something about the platforms and the silos within which a certain generation is getting their information from, and what that then prompts in the cultural arena. So it makes sense that, obviously people are going to be more exercised and call for certain things and put pressure on certain things and be active on certain things when they're seeing, the types of footage and, and a lot of kind of flattened information, I guess, a lot of like very simple information that is digested in a particular way. It makes sense that it's that generation, consuming that information that is, I suppose, confronting this moment in such a visceral manner. And obviously then the cultural realm is going to have, consequences for that. It's a very exposing time, I think, for all of these structures as well.
So with that in mind, then what about what's been happening with Kneecap then? Because, obviously one of the members is now being called up in court in the UK on a terrorism charge. So, I mean, obviously they've been so positive and outspoken about their support for Palestine over many years. So even when like the Coachella stuff happened a couple of months ago, a month and a half ago, it was no surprise to anyone that they were doing this. And that's why in the initial aftermath, you're like, well, of course they were going to do that. Of course they were going to do that. But then, you know, the fallout of all that was been interesting as well, because we had, you know, essentially it does feel like the band were almost, people were trying to cancel them. People were trying to tell other people not to book them. They were trying to find footage, and this is what's happened. The footage has come out of the Mo Chara with a Hezbollah flag, and then therefore this is what's happening now. But it does feel like, I don't know if you noticed it, but it does feel like there's huge, and I'm not that I'm surprised, but I'm kind of heartened as well, but I'm also just like, okay, there's a huge amount of positive support for what Kneecap are doing around the world. And they've really become a totem almost of what's happening with all this stuff.
Mm. I mean, it's interesting because Kneecap are at pains to say that they are not the story. They say that genocide is the story, that this is a distraction and so on. But in a way, it is also, you know, a part of the story as well. Obviously, their activism on Palestine is not a new thing. This is something they've spoken about from the jump. And I think what it also shows, the Coachella thing, is how much of a different context we are operating in Ireland compared to the US. I mean, it's profound. I mean, it's kind of profound the Ireland and everywhere else almost. I mean, okay, maybe Spain, maybe, you know, there obviously is loads of activism and protests happening in the US and in the UK and around Europe and all that kind of stuff, but there is a quality to what is happening in Ireland that doesn't exist in the same way elsewhere for all of the reasons that we understand. And I think, of course, you know, the projection that they put up that got all of the heat, you know, fuck Israel, free Palestine. This is a bog standard thing that's said at every protest in Ireland at the weekend. Do you know what I mean? So I think we have a different, we subsume that quite differently in this country. And that is just not the case in the US. Like it just isn't, you know, the political power of pro-Israel, pro-Netanyahu factions is immense. I was at the Bernie Sanders talk in Vicar Street this week, and, you know, he was fully talking about the reason that, you know, the Dems won't come on board with his motions or whatever he's doing to try and stop the funding of arms to Netanyahu is because of the political power of AIPAC, that they'll just, that super PAC will just completely unelect you, basically take you down. And, you know, the other part is America is a very puritanical society. I mean, that's the complete conflict with what's happening there at the moment, you know, and what has always happened there, that, you know, obviously it's a society built on violence that calls itself free, and it has all these massive contradictions. But one of the things that it does consistently is generate controversies around artists who are speaking out. You know, whether you were Madonna or Sinead O'Connor or Odd Future or Eminem or whatever, you know.
Dixie Chicks.
Dixie Chicks, exactly. Yeah. What the Chicks, as they're now called, like whatever. Chicks. And you can say the most mild thing. I mean, what did the Chicks do? They said, oh, you know, we're not proud of, you know, we're kind of ashamed that George W. Bush comes from Texas, you know, and it completely threw their careers through a loop. So there is a weird attitude towards freedom of expression and creative expression of artists in the US as well. It's pretty obvious that there was a concerted effort after that happened, the gig happened in Coachella, to basically call Kneecap to account in this very wild way. The Daily Mail last week, of all places, reported on leaked kind of legal letters on the back of leaked emails of music agents that were pressuring festivals to pull Kneecap from their lineups, and there could be some defamation proceedings happening in that realm. So we won't go into that too much, but it's very obvious that this is what was happening. This was also kind of old footage, and obviously for legal reasons can't get into the charges anyway. But that's very, very acute, and I think that, of course, people in Ireland are going to be like, sure, these projections are at every big festival that they do. And they're also, they put the projection up at Glasgow or Reading or wherever, and that it's nothing new to us. But that is just not going to, we see the pressure that comes on when you actually try to speak out on that. I mean, Macklemore has obviously facing similar things, Kalani, different artists who are speaking out.
Yeah, I think it just shows you, if in case you had forgotten, that the fundamental difference between how we address cultural stuff like this and also the fundamental differences in how people operate in Europe, Ireland, with America, is where you see, the pro-Israel agents and booking agents and people like that, where people were cancelled from TV shows and taken out, like you were saying there, Kalani, and I think it was No Name had a gig cancelled in New York. Like, all she did was speak out in support of Palestine. It's crazy that this is what happens over there, but that is the environment. That is what is happening there over and over again. People losing their booking agents because they say they don't want children to be killed en masse. It's like there's a fundamental broken thing happening over there, which when we see this, and this is a case of the Kneecap stuff happening around Coachella, you're like, wow, the reaction to that is so extreme.
But then you have the UK reaction as well, right? You have the...
True. But I mean, that's part of it as well. It's always like, it seems like, there's a protection of the idea of, I believe that the state of Israel shouldn't have existed in the first place, but that is a controversial statement to say in some places. But this is, the British were a key part of the state of Israel at the beginning of it. So you're like, it comes back to some of that stuff. It's like the lobby and all that kind of stuff is so strong and the way that people get thrown being called an anti-Semite because they support or say they want people to stop being killed. I think it's part of that.
Yeah, I mean, I also think it's a complex thing to discuss without falling into various traps or generalisms, because what we also know is when we discuss, there's this concerted effort or this lobby or whatever, we also know that there are, forever genuinely anti-Semitic tropes and phraseology on the right that basically point to, targeting Jewish people as somehow in control of certain things. And it's really important to point out constantly, this is not to do with religion. It's not to do with Jewish people. This is about the state of Israel. It's about an extremist right-wing government in Israel and what that government is instructing its military to do, and what that military is actually doing, and the consequences for Palestinians. And those consequences have been going on, for 80 years more. Do you know what I mean? So like it's you can see how the trigger point in the US related to this immediately goes to anti-Semitism as something to discredit people, because of that context. Now that's completely disingenuous in this context, but it is an easy button to push, and it's a very effective button to push, and that's really it drives people into a cul-de-sac where they feel, I suppose, they're not free to actually say this is not to do with religion. This is actually to do with the state's actions. And that's very challenging, I think, for people. It completely shuts down conversation. And yeah, I think we need to, it's wild how different, the European context and specifically the Irish context is to the US. I mean, I've been spending a lot of time in the US over the past few years, and since October 7th, take a city like New York. I mean, you will walk around for months and not see a single signifier or symbol of Palestinian solidarity at all. Like you might see a tiny little flag in a shop, or if you're in, you know, a queer bookshop or something like that, there might be something there. But it's and you cannot speak freely about this, you know, in a city like New York. In my experience, you have to be very careful in the public realm because of how heightened the atmosphere is there around the crackdown of freedom of expression in general. And the crackdown on this specifically is part of, obviously, their broader slide into authoritarianism. It's an aspect of it. It's a quality of it. And, you know, the reality is we know now, you know, looking at what happened in Columbia University and the shutting down of protests there and people being fired and kids getting their degrees taken away from them and all that kind of stuff, you know, it was easy for people, given the context, to not stand up against that because they don't want to touch Palestinian solidarity or critiques of Israel. And unfortunately for that country, that gives license for all sorts of protests to be shut down and all sorts of protests to be targeted. Where it is much more visible in the US, in my experience, specifically in New York, is in queer activism. Like, well, I was there for Pride last year, and I think the official LGBT Pride parade or march or whatever they call it was like, had this really lame, weak sauce slogan like remember, reflect or something. And then the lesbian march, the Dyke March, their slogan was Dykes against genocide. So you can kind of see the difference there. But anyway, we're kind of getting off track. I mean, with the Kneecap thing, I wrote a piece for the Irish Times this week, kind of saying, you know, regardless of what you think of what they said or didn't say or do or didn't do, or you think about the group, whatever, this is about proportionality and the pursuit, quite rapid pursuit of charges against Mo Chara. These kind of types of investigations, I mean, you'd kind of expect them to just like languish, you know, but the fact that was pursued so quickly, and then he's going to be up in court in June, the day before their show in Fairview Park in Dublin, you know, and it like that says something to me. And I think it says something to everyone when at the same time you have these human rights lawyers, really well-respected people who worked on the Stephen Lawrence case, on the Grenfell case, on the Birmingham 6 case, submitting, you know, 240-page documents to the Met Police War Crimes Unit saying, here are 10 British citizens that we have identified who they have allegations with regards to potential war crimes or international core crimes. Obviously, that takes much longer to investigate. But I think when people are seeing this hypocrisy, perceived double standards, they just kind of go like, who are we calling to heel here? You know, and why this, why now? And I just think that just gives rise to a lot of, just people feeling like they have a lack of agency or just a huge distrust. But at the same time, I think when you saw the crowd, I wasn't there, but I just watched kind of videos of it online and stuff, at the Wide Awake Festival, when you see that number of people, the fact that festival actually, you know, didn't pull the gig, and fair play to them, when you see that crowd, when you see that support, when you see that energy, you know, you do think that there is merit to stuff that Kneecap are saying on stage, and that they've said afterwards about Coachella, that people were coming up to them saying, you know, thanks so much for saying this. We can't say this here or whatever. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. And I do think that, you know, just to go back to what I said about them saying that they're not the story. No, they're not the geopolitical story. You know, they're not the story of what's happening on the ground in Gaza and the West Bank, but they are part of something very significant that's happening, that they've become this kind of fulcrum, I guess, of this kind of stuff, and that a lot of kids basically are saying, no, we're not going to stand with these crimes that are happening, these war crimes that are happening in Gaza, we're actually going to stand with the people who are calling them out. And I think that is very threatening. I think that's very threatening to the system, basically, however you want to frame it.
Yeah. With the upcoming court case, do you feel like, because I mean, I know I saw Fontaines and Lancome over the weekend at the Lovely Days Festival at Guinness, and Brady Pete during the set was like, who's coming to London on June 18th? I know a few people are going to show up at the court that I've heard. It does feel like, I mean, depending on how the whole thing goes, it does have the potential to be a very negative spectacle for the UK government, I believe. It certainly feels like that to me, because you clearly expedite some sort of charges because, first of all, Kneecap have traditionally always upset the establishment in Britain with the especially they took them to court last year over the funding stuff. So they're not people who will idly and quietly shut up really about anything they have to say, and they've shown that, and they've won in court previously against the UK government. And so I kind of feel, I don't know what like is going to happen at that court case, or like even what the plan is for it, but like it does feel like the UK government is potentially creating a very negative flashpoint for themselves as well.
Yeah, I mean the state, I guess, rather than the government, right?
Yeah.
This is the police and that we're talking about, and the judicial system, and I suppose the state apparatus, that mediates the state through its various apparatus. Look, no matter what happens with this, the UK government is going to end up looking like a chump, and that has been the case. I mean, on the funding thing last year, when Badenoch was the trade secretary, when I heard that story, that they had, that there was something weird going on with that funding being released or it being pulled or whatever, I got onto the Department of Trade or whatever it was, Business and Trade or something, and the statement that they gave back, which was, I was shocked when I read it, being, we're hardly going to, fund people who don't, believe in the UK or something. It's like, it didn't seem to have any understanding that these are artists who pay tax in the UK, and really that kind of statement, which was so inflammatory, catalyzed the ability for Kneecap and their legal team to point out, look, they're saying it in black and white, and that made them look like absolute fools, made Badenoch and the then Tory government look like fools. Now, the thing is, when you are standing in your truth and integrity and your position, and other people are less so, I mean, I think we can all agree that the UK has been pretty lacking on tackling the war crimes that are happening in Gaza, to say the least. That is a very kind of stark thing. And in a weird way, the charges don't really matter. Like, even though they do, what was done, it kind of slides into the background because things become symbolic and thematic of a broader hypocrisy. And whatever happens, if there ends up being, a pop-up trad session or rave or a crowd of people coming out, I mean, that generates a spectacle that interrupts the spectacle of the state and the spectacle of this kind of policing that's happening. And of course, that's going to be uncomfortable. And of course, there's going to be photographers there. Those are the images that are going to come out of that. And I suppose it's more than what happens next for them in their capacity to tour, particularly in the US. I think the Wide Awake Festival sent a message, that performance sent a message as well of their popularity, that people want to go see them, that the shows are great. I mean, it was kind of stunning to see almost universally the show lauded in very conservative British media outlets, like the Telegraph. I mean, there was a piece.
Really, yeah,
there was a piece in the Daily Express the other day, that was basically saying, the British state is wrong and Kneecap are right. I mean, in the Express. So there's something happening there as well.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting, and there's so much to consider around all that stuff, and it is part of the wider, discussion we're having here about, that's an artist almost being boycotted or attempted to be boycotted for their beliefs. The flip side of that is obviously there's been such an awakening of people having an idea about the funding of music festivals. I mentioned Superstruct, who are a multinational company who own 80 different festivals. I did see somebody yesterday in a comment on Instagram say, Superstruct own all of these Irish festivals, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, what is this guy talking about? And I realized when you Google it, and this is a bit scary as well, Google AI gives you the wrong information about boycotts. Yeah, gives you the wrong information about Superstruct and Irish festivals, and it tells you that all of these festivals are owned by Superstruct, including Electric Picnic and Longitude and Beyond the Pale. And it's just like it's trying to give you an answer that it wants. You want an answer? I'll give you this answer.
Yeah, so people really need to stop. I know you can't disable it, or it's quite hard to disable. People really need to just stop looking at that bloody AI thing on Chrome.
I don't even know if you can disable
No,
it.
I don't think you can, yeah.
It's scary stuff. It's scary stuff for somebody like myself who like runs a website and then you see your content just shows up at the start, without anyone actually reading the thing. It just like interprets it for you. Anyway, my point being that, there has been, the last month in particular, has been such a flurry of activity from artists. And this is something we're seeing a lot at the moment, where whether it's Superstruct, who own festivals like Sziget, Sonar, Why Not, Mighty Hoopla, Field Day, which happened last week, Oya, Boiler Room, or another private investment company, which, there are plenty of them now that operate in music. And so I wanted to have a little bit of chat with you about that as well, because, we're talking about monopolies essentially in music, right? Especially in the live music sector, because that's where the money is perceived to be. So what are your feelings on those kind of issues that people have been having? Obviously, I understand, and I understand that people, you have to take a stand at some point, and I understand why people are doing, calling out with the Superstruct stuff in particular. There's been all of these statements from the festivals, a statement from Superstruct themselves, all of them at pains to say that they operate financially or independently from their owners, including Superstruct themselves, basically saying all revenues and profits from Superstruct events and festival remain entirely within our business and goes towards the ongoing development and staging of our festivals across the world. But, the problem here is that it's owned by the second largest private equity firm, KKR, which does invest in weapons manufacturers, Israeli companies that develop data centers, and advertising real estate companies that advertise and have a state on illegally occupied land in Palestine. So that's the reason why this stuff is happening. So, I mean, we've seen it as well in Germany with Strike Germany, for example, where, there's been a call for artists not to play cultural institutions. So how do you feel about all this stuff now? Like, where are we at with it? What is everyone has to individually decide what their line is, and then how they, but you were making the point to me there, if you are a single artist who's maybe working and offered an opportunity, is it better then to play something and make a statement, as we've seen some artists do, like the Murder Capital, for example, was a good example. Their actions in Germany where they had the 2 gigs that were cancelled because they weren't allowed to show their Palestinian flag created a lot of interest and headlines and awareness.
Yeah. I mean,
as opposed to not playing at all. So
yeah, I mean, I think
where's the line? I guess it depends.
There's kind of a few things there. I mean, first of all, there's private equity in the cultural sphere, like private equity in music festivals, which wouldn't be my jam, more generally. And it obviously is, look, this is a symptom of global capital, global capitalism and ownership, and the KKR ownership of Superstruct, and it in turn is backed by, I think it's, what is it, Providence Equity Partners, and the state. Once you start to kind of lift the lid on these things, the stakes that they have in different things, whether it's candle calling or, the Mighty Hoopla, this queer festival, or Sziget or Sonar or whatever. And I think also bought Boiler Room from Dice, right?
Yeah.
And then also kind of owns or has invested in, owns parts of Politico and, Bild, the German tabloid, which is a bad newspaper. And then all of these other kind of, defense and defense tech companies and all that kind of stuff. So there's the top line issue of private equity in festivals. I mean, I think Superstruck saying, well, we're totally independent and we have all of our own profits and nothing goes back. I mean, I don't really know how that sits perception wise, because they are still owned by this private equity firm. So the independence, okay, that might actually be what's happening in practice, but the ownership is what people are taking.
Well, all the revenues and profits that you create creates the value for this company or KKR that will ultimately use that and sell you on and make the profit off you.
Yeah, exactly.
That's where it's.
I mean, the issue there, it's kind of like, how far do you go? Because if you peel back, any number of housing developments in Dublin, or, for example, and look at the private equity behind them, or any kind of, global company, if you look at, you look Microsoft, you look, all these kind of things, it's like, under capitalism, when it comes to, the basically $1 billion companies and private equity firms and investment firms and stuff, not a lot of this stuff is going to be clean, and that's a problem of the system that we're living under, because it makes us often totally unknowingly complicit in where these financial flows are actually ending up, and what else they're funding, who else is benefiting from them, all that kind of stuff. So it's like, well, how far do you go? Where do you stop? We need a different system. That's the existential issue around that kind of stuff. When it comes to the boycotts or people, pulling out of stuff or protesting stuff, I think it can be, it's simple and it's complex. Like, I think what happened at South by Southwest last year ended up being very powerful with regards to the US Army sponsorship around that, and also Barclays with Latitude and so on, as you pointed out. Like, those things were effective. So it's actually about what is effective and what can generate solidarity and what can generate awareness. Because I think we talk a lot about boycotts or people being called out, or, pressure being put on artists to do certain things. And I understand the impulse for that, and sometimes that's very warranted. But I think we need to talk an awful lot about solidarity as well, and how we can actually support artists and support everyone, who are actually, trying to do the right thing and taking a stand on the various, like, I think the Murder Capital gigs in Germany were a really good example. Strike Germany, which is basically a cultural boycott, essentially, of German cultural institutions, I think is, it's an interesting thing. People are still showing work in Germany or playing German things or whatever, and so it's sometimes the lines of boycotts can become quite blurry, and people are getting called out for stuff that the parameters of it aren't actually very clear. And I think that's why it's always useful to go back to BDS's own kind of guide, so they have their like target selection criteria, and they have their operational principles and all that kind of stuff. And the BDS movement's kind of philosophy, I suppose, is that they kind of choose a number of smaller targets that can get more traction as opposed to spreading the net super, super wide, because it can become quite existential for people. Again, that kind of how far do you go thing, like we're all living under this system. I think what Murder Capital did in terms of actually trying to play those gigs, and then their expression in terms of having a flag on stage being shut down, as you said, it raised a lot of awareness. It made people understand what the context is like in Germany right now in terms of freedom of expression, basically. And a lot of people are really struggling, particularly in Berlin, in the artist and cultural and creative community there, with what is happening, with the police violence, with, you know, the moving goalposts on what is banned or outlawed or what you can say or can't say. And a lot of that is going very underreported. I've done a lot of reporting on the attempted deportations of Irish protesters over there as well. So I kind of understand that context a lot. But I think it can be very difficult for artists who are trying to actually perform and make their art and have careers. And I think that, you know, of course, now is the time where we have to take a stand and speak the truth and call things out. And I think that's really, really important. And I think especially larger artists that actually have power, who are protected because of their wealth and because of how so many people are dependent on them for a living, be that a label or various teams, all that kind of stuff. I think that's really important. I have to say, I often feel sorry for, you know, smaller independent artists who are being pressured or dragged or whatever or policed in different ways, or things are demanded of them when they're operating with very limited resources. And it's very difficult for, you know, smaller independent artists who may not have a lot, you know, a kind of a deep infrastructure of support around them, to also have to develop an activist strategy effectively along with their creative work. So I think, you know, yes, we can talk about calling people out and pressure and boycotts, but we also need to talk about solidarity. And we, you know, everybody is going to have a different approach to this. And I'm not saying that some approaches, if it's totally like vague and like milquetoast, okay, that's fine. But, you know, I do think the kind of the piling on, or, you know, finding, you know, huge flaws that are unforgivable to you of, you know, 10% of people's otherwise really good actions and positions is not, it's not that it's not helpful, it's just not effective. Like what is the outcome there with what you're trying to achieve? So, you know, like, and then you're talking about artists who are at essentially the bottom rung of the industry, who are making, you know, the least money, sacrificing the most financially, when you have people like, you know, Bono, for example, trying to excuse his position away. And he said that thing the other night. So
last week was the first time he said anything about it.
Yeah, well, he had this something he said in a performance, which was like, Hamas, release the hostages. Israel, release yourself from Netanyahu. I'm like, what are you trying to do? Like, cast a spell? Like, what is this garbage rhetoric? Say what you say, you know, say what you mean. That doesn't sound like it's coming from a place of authenticity or integrity to me. And so, like, yeah, that's what I feel about those kind of things. But it is about what's effective, and it is about solidarity. And I think,
do you think we learned a lot of, in the time during COVID, there was a lot of talk about, especially with Black Lives Matter stuff, and there was a lot of internet call outs where people pressure on people to like do stuff or cancel things. And I feel like some of the actions we're seeing now is maybe representative of those kind of things where you were like, people were looking for accountability.
Yeah.
And you're seeing, say, a good example is Ravers for Palestine, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. They say they demand solidarity with Palestine from club culture, but it does feel like, it rather than target, a lot of this is around the KKR stuff, but it also, there are other, like Hor Berlin is one example which have been criticized heavily.
Yeah.
Now in the early time of after October 7th, there was a lot of talk about Hor Berlin because they didn't allow two DJs to show Palestine solidarity. But I think since then they've actually been much better. So it's like, I don't know if that's if they're the right people to be targeting or whatever. It's I don't know for sure.
Berghain has been kind of called out as well. Yeah. I mean,
like, what's the latest with that even? I actually don't even know what the latest with Berghain. I don't really know.
I haven't been paying that much attention to that. I think it's like, what is the purpose of your call out? And where is it coming from? Because I actually think what's happening now it feels so also trivial and pedantic to be, talking about these kind of smaller things given the broader context, but we are, right? So, and I think, it's a worthy discussion as well, but I actually think it's less hectic than it has been previously. I also think that, you mentioned the pandemic, like the pandemic is still in play in terms of people's the reverberations of people's frustrations around that time, like maybe in the subconscious, but I also think that's still in play and is probably a factor in so many of the fucked up things we're seeing happen in the world, with people reacting either on a micro or macro scale with this kind of anger and frustration. But I do think it's less hectic, but I also, and it's absolutely a call for accountability. But the accountability we need to be calling for is from our governments and from the people who are funding this horror and arming it. That's where the accountability it needs to be. And that's where the protest and the energy needs to be directed towards. Because if you pile on band or a DJ or a venue or something like that, okay, maybe there's, some kind of virtuous goal in that, or maybe you're trying to kind of elevate your own righteousness or ego over something that you feel is not meeting your personal bar. But how is that effective in actually challenging what's happening? And, I also think that it is effective to make your voice heard with regards to mainstream media. As somebody who works in mainstream media, I mean, I'm getting like dozens of emails a day or whatever from people. Obviously, they're like heavily formatted emails because I understand that these are like different drives that people are trying to pressure journalists and stuff. And like, I welcome that stuff. I'm not defensive about that stuff because I'm, often writing about Palestine, and this is what activism looks like. It has many different shades and people use different kind of tactics, but it is about what is effective. And I think, not to kind of go into the psychoanalysis of it, but I often feel that when we feel that somebody that we admire or think is like-minded, or something that's very close to us that we usually trust, doesn't meet our bar, that becomes a very safe place for us to actually target. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of like if something happens to you in work and you have a really shit day and you go home and you like are suddenly snappy with like your housemate or family member or partner or something, it's like they become this kind of vessel for you to project your anger into. But like that's not addressing what's happening.
You're spending so much energy like giving out to artists and playing festivals which have questionable backgrounds, financial backgrounds, and maybe should put that into addressing, like say, you're like I guess we're all
but
I get it.
Now. I get it, and I get I get the demand for accountability, and I think artists who are like, no, I don't like who owns this festival or who they're ultimately owned by and who they're doing business with, and I don't want to play and I find this unethical. Great, like that is a great stance, and I think that there has been. It can feel. I think it's just this scatterdash approach sometimes to try and pull people down who are maybe very, like, I'm just coming from a human level, who might be very like nervous or don't know what to do or aren't educated enough or don't have the resources or aren't saying enough of what people want. You know, is your time spent, you know, dragging people like that? I don't think there's a tremendous amount of stuff going on, you know, like that, but it is a quality of it. Like, is that effective? You know, and we have to keep coming back to what is effective activism. It is inevitable in so much activism that there's infighting, splits, purity tests, you know, all this kind of, you know, fractious stuff. But if people are potential allies, there are probably, you know, better ways to approach things that don't actually end up ultimately shutting down what their potential solidarity will be and their potential action will be. And I have sympathy for artists who are like, I'm not doing enough, or should I do this statement, or should I play this festival or whatever. You can and for artists listening to this, like, who maybe haven't said anything or whatever, I mean, why? First of all, you know, it's easy to stand up against war. It's easy to stand up against this slaughter that's happening. But, like, you know, you can just do one thing. You can put on your social media, like, we think this is appalling and we're going to donate however much this, or we're not going to play certain things, and we're going to, you know, do this merch that funds this thing. Like, those are not challenging stances to take. So if somebody's saying nothing at all, you know, that's bullshit. You know, like, I find it really hard to look, you know, something like the Cowboy Carter tour right now, you know, and see one of the most powerful, or like Taylor Swift's Eras tour, or any of these things, and be like, oh my God, like, you have such a platform. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, you have such a platform, and you're not.
It's self-interest on different levels. I mean, that's what stops everybody from to speaking out. Who doesn't speak out? They, you know, they're scared. They're scared. They're protecting what's theirs.
Yeah.
We talk to artists.
I get it. But that, you know, and I don't know why I mentioned 2 female artists there as well, because obviously there's, like, you know, so many people that could be mentioned, but.
Well, because of the biggest artist in the world.
Yeah,
probably.
I mean, probably. But yeah, I think it's about what's effective. And, like, you know, the other thing is, this is such a bleak time and such a horrific thing that we're all witnessing. I think it's doing, like, a moral injury to us all. I think our, like, souls are hurting when we're looking at this pain hour by hour, day by day. But if you look at this global network, this national network in Ireland and global network of activism that is being created, where people are saying, we are not going to stand for this. And the people are out on the streets. They're doing everything they can. They're doing things in their own way with whatever resources and tools they have at their disposal. They're challenging the structures, the financial structures, the, you know, business structures, the political structures, the geopolitical structures, the institutional structures that are allowing this to happen on their watch. Like, that is extremely powerful, you know, and this time it is changing everything and is going to change everything, you know, and we need to kind of hold on to that as well, because it's very, very powerful what's happening right now in terms of the activism and the solidarity, and the artists who are part of that, and artists are always to the forefront of that, are vital as well, because, you know, the reason that people call on artists to speak is because artists give us fucking life, you know, like that, like, and you know, they're so vital and we need them so much. So that's also, you know, really important. But where this goes in terms of, to go back to the festival ownership thing, like, where this goes in terms of that stuff, I think that's interesting as well, because, like, private equity, you know, these massive private investment funds involved in festivals, like, gross. Do you know what I mean? Like, and but then it's like, everybody knows who works in festivals, especially independent festivals or quasi-independent festivals, knows how hard it is right now for those to be in any way financially viable or sustainable. So I can understand if somebody comes in and goes, here, I'm going to buy you out, I'm going to take 70%. It's like, okay, fine, now the boot's off my neck. But you might have just put a bigger boot on top of your neck, by making that deal.
Which is, I guess that's why I like, it was like there's so many people twisting their ideas and thoughts about who are involved in all of this stuff, who were, especially with Boiler Room, was like, we can't divest from our owners. I was like, yeah, but doesn't mean you have to work for them necessarily.
Yeah,
if
and
you're not
also
happy about
you
it.
made that call. Like nobody gets magic. These are not hostile takeovers. People made deals, and you have to live with those deals, and that's just the reality. I mean, I have a very hard line, for example, around anything to do with brands and things like that. Like, and that's just my line. And I understand that loads of people don't, and they do it, and that's how they make money, and that's fine. I don't judge it at all, but people have to. It's part of our culture as well, because this concept of selling out or whatever is a total generation gap. That's over, and people have been put in positions with regards to being individuals that have to make money in a particular way, and brands can fill that gap, and brands are owned by conglomerates, and conglomerates have massive investors and other owners, and that's the system that we live under. But I suppose maybe something that will come out of it is that maybe this will scare or shame people into making festivals or companies or whatever into making more ethical choices. I mean, this is before we even get into the antitrust case that the US Department of Justice is taking against Ticketmaster and Live Nation, which is next March. I think that starts. So there's big money is never clean. I think that's the moral of the story, really. But I think
I think we all have to, I think there's just an increased awareness, and especially with punters, if you want to call them, people who go to festivals and be like, oh, these things matter. My decisions matter about where I attend, and because you can decide to make that change to go, okay, I'm going to go to the local community event instead of the big commercial one. You know what I mean? And you'll probably find you'll have a better time.
Yeah, I mean,
probably fine. Yeah.
I find that definitely in recent years, I'm definitely more drawn to, in the past decade or so, definitely more drawn to, the smaller, the more experimental, I don't want to walk into a greenfield site and feel like I'm in a mall, just being blared at with this branding that, for some people it's their like goal, the bigger to get involved with, massive brands, okay, whatever. That's not my position. But like, look, the consumer has power, but the consumer is also living under a system where all sorts of stuff is happening that is intentionally kept from us with regards to global capital. And so, it's important not to tie yourself in knots with it as well, and just try to make your own ethical choices and try to build solidarity. And actually on this, before we finish the conversation, I would like to make some kind of recommendations of stuff to read or watch in this time where we're kind of spiraling a bit. But Let the Record Show, which is an oral history of ACT UP New York by Sarah Schulman, is amazing on activism and what is effective and how to build movements that are actually very porous and malleable, where there's loads of different entry points into them, where people, tools, not rules, right? Where people use what they have at their disposal and their different privileges to engage in activism however they can. Really, really instructive, great book. Also, I found the latest documentary on John Lennon and Yoko Ono really, really interesting, almost eerie in its echoes with regards to this time that we're in around the intersection of artists and activism. It just follows their time when they were living in New York. Obviously, the Vietnam War was happening. I'm not a massive Beatles. I have this weird thing where I'm like not really into the Beatles music, but I'm very into the people in the Beatles. And that's kind of always been the case. It's really great. It's uncanny at times. And then the other thing is a documentary on the Weather Underground, which was a kind of radical leftist group that ended up committing a lot of acts of violence in the US, also during the Vietnam War. And the reason that I mentioned that documentary is there's a line in it where one of them says, when you think you've right on your side, you can do some horrible things. And also this line that the Vietnam War made us crazy, And I think I really feel that what's happening in Palestine is it's making me crazy, Not crazy, but it's hard. And I think
frustration on a level that that feels hard to grasp.
Yeah, and then it feels really stupid, and it feels just idiotic to even say that you're finding it hard. Do you know what I mean? When people are suffering on the ground, there is just it's just sick. But that's an interesting touchstone as well, to know what infighting looks like and what happens when people lose perspective and meet violence with violence. And I think we need to keep all of those things in our mind as well, because this is changing everything, and we're living in revolutionary times,
Yeah. And that can be a positive thing as well.
Right.
Thank you to Una Mullally for that extensive and really insightful chat. If you go back in the archives, you can listen to very recently Roisin El-Sharif talking about the people of Palestine and the Palestinian cause. And also there's an episode with May Kay about her visits there a couple of years ago as well. So much more about that. I would encourage you at very least to join the BDS movement. That means not buying Coca-Cola, stuff like that. Have a look. It's a targeted campaign. If you aren't aware of it, it's really easy to do in your daily life. It's the way that the Palestinian people want you to do that. They want you to put pressure on these companies who support and help Israel do what they're doing. Yeah, that's a start. I'm sure a lot of people are aware of it, but I think it's really important to just, underscore that, and really you can make a difference as a singular person. And it feels like sometimes we really can't make a difference, but there are small things we can do that collectively make a huge difference. So hopefully there's some food for thought there for you. If you like what we do, it's patreon.com/Nighter9 to support us. We always appreciate support. That's it for me. Bye.